Welcome to the Game of Attention. I'm your host, Becca Ventham. Today we're talking about personalization and how data drives that. Research has found that 71% of consumers expect personalized experiences, with 76% of them saying that it's more likely to make them buy again. But at the same time, half of consumers don't trust brands to use their data correctly. So where does that leave us? Today, to discuss it, we've got Rob and Ross with us. Rob, would you like to introduce yourself and share a bit about your experience?
Sure. My name is Rob Edwards. I head up the media and digital team for Arla Foods in the UK. So my responsibility is to deliver paid activations for our 14 brands in the UK and ensure that our consumers are being entertained, inspired from our selection of foods and drinks that we have within our stable. My experience is more than 2 decades, let's put it like that, in media and agencies across the UK. So starting a long time ago in print media, when we used to do mono advertising and read out the copy to each other at The Guardian, and then moving through into more digitized content with other businesses like what is now Capital Radio and Bauer Media.
So my name is Ross Halliwell. I work for the Mars agency based out of London, and we're a global connected commerce agency, helping our clients with all things from shopper marketing, e-commerce, retail media, creative analytics, and plenty more of that. And from my experience, I've spent the best part of 12 years specifically working on brands in the e-commerce space. So experienced multiple different things during those times and multiple different roles too.
Thank you both for being here. Rob, if I can pass the first question to you, how do personalized recommendations and targeted advertising impact consumer behavior and brand loyalty in the e-commerce landscape?
I think there are two simple answers to this, either incredibly well or incredibly poorly. So dependent on how you go to market, dependent on the data and the way you approach the concept of engaging with consumers, it can be tremendously powerful as an accelerator to loyalty from a consumer. If you get it the opposite end of the spectrum, it can turn people off. It's not authentic. It's not in line with their need state or their lifestyle. And if that's the case, then it's a quick turn off. So it's a really important piece of focus for us within our business. We don't have first party data, so we have to rely on third party support and using the time and energy to get into that granular detail around persona behavior for our categories, for our products is really important. And, I'd like to say we get it right. There are times when we get it wrong, but you have to learn and learn fast from that. So really two ends of the spectrum. It can be a superpower or it can be an absolute turn off.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Rob. I think it's the classic right message to the right shopper at the right time, and if you miss any one of those three rights, that's where it kind of falls off in that sense. But clearly the opportunity is huge in that respect. In terms of we see better dwell time, reduced acquisition costs, improved conversion, average order value and volume going up, and clearly it all kind of drives that flywheel of loyalty in terms of recommendation and repeat purchase. So all of the good stuff from an overall kind of metrics perspective is what it drives when it goes well, but equally the opposite applies.
What we look into, and I think there's a real kind of, I won't say tension, but I think a real focus for us internally is around KPIs. So when we look at media metrics, we look at effectiveness. We can drive and be successful in determining KPIs and success in KPIs. But those KPIs also have to connect to a consumer output or conversion. If it's all about reach, if it's all about getting eyeballs, then you can win. But are you winning on the bottom line? So for a CPG or FMCG business, that connectivity of KPIs along with your measurement and approach and tactics is really important. I've worked in businesses where it's not been the same, and KPIs drive people apart and business and departments apart. So I think there's a real kind of premise around how answering the question you've asked, but also internally as a business, it's really important that KPIs align through that process of sales and marketing together, working in harmony. Because if you're telling the right message, you're telling the right people, great. But if the sales approach and the impact in store is not there, then there's a disparity there. So I think KPIs, the ways of working internally for a brand are equally as important as the tactics and the technology that these days we've got at our fingertips as well.
Certainly see that a lot with the metrics that aren't quite perhaps aligned, if you will, from whether or not it's sales driven, and people looking at ROI and ROAS. That's where it tends to fall down, depending on what people are targeting. Right, that's the kind of sweet spot from an alignment perspective that I think from an industry perspective that always want to get right, but doesn't necessarily always go to plan, right? But
it's
ultimately,
really important, Ross. I think your point on ROAS is a real one. We're old enough and long enough in the tooth to have been involved in many different businesses with many different clients, and you can play the ROAS game. I can play the performance game, but is it driving branded growth? Is it driving sales really outside of a core cohort of consumers? Potentially not. So this concept of incremental growth and understanding new data that's coming in, and ROAS, I guess, is just an extension of that. But I think that's the really important phase when you start to look at, again, how do you drive consumer loyalty and connectivity outside of the people that know you?
On the side of like when you get it wrong and that damage to reputation, is there a way, do you think that loss of trust can be regained in your experience?
For me, yes, if you go about it in an authentic way. And I take the same approach to my children. If you get things wrong, hold your hand up. It's the same thing with me in the way I report to my director. There'll be times when, for the best will intended, things don't go quite as they should do. But if you learn from it and learn fast and then come out with authentic responses to it, then there's an opportunity to do that. Human nature is very much, you don't tend to focus on the happy. You tend to focus on the negative, and that's the implications of brand. And sometimes I think that keeps brand on a very kind of conservative approach to this. They don't want to push the boat out. They don't want to be truly innovative because the fear of failure can stop that inspiration or that innovation. But I think you can. That's my opinion. I think you can, as long as you're authentic with your response and it's a fast response.
I don't know how much of you guys have seen of Oakley and, well, specifically Surreal and what they're kind of doing with their marketing and their copy. And they're really kind of, it feels like a very Marmite approach. They are disruptive, but so many people don't like it.
I think it's classic challenger brand behaviour in that sense. Personally, I quite enjoyed some of the stuff they put out there, and I think I've certainly seen some of the comments on LinkedIn can be quite polarizing in that sense. But I think it gets people talking. It's a PR game in that sense for them, and I'm sure it's working well for them in that regard. But I don't think there's necessarily any harm, I guess, as such as coming of it in that sense. It's just not necessarily going to be for everyone in terms of that tone of voice and the humour that they bring to fore.
As a disruptor, sometimes it's easier to do that. If you're a small brand that's looking to make a name for yourself, you're incredibly, or in theory, incredibly agile. Larger brands, I think, find that more difficult, which is why there's always a focus on how do you evolve your creative authentically? What's your story and how does that evolve? Every brand suffers from that. There's few brands that really kind of keep creating something incredibly world changing. Every 3-year cycle of creative requirements. It's so difficult, but you're all trying to do it because the opportunity to do that is consumer loyalty, is the ability to grow your brands long term and short term in sales. So it's interesting. I do wonder with something like with the smaller disruptors whether or not that changes as they grow and get bigger, and suddenly the impetus for growth slows because of the business decision making becomes a bigger and a more important choice for them.
Do you think AI-driven personalization can lead to unexpected consumer discoveries, or does it risk narrowing consumer choices to what the algorithm predicts that they'll like?
Without the danger of sitting on the fence, it's arguably both, depending on what the shopper experience is like ultimately, and I guess the intelligence that sits behind that from an AI perspective. The machine learning and the data in which the AI is drawing from, because it's only as good as that it's got to draw from in that sense. I think it's also a case of striking the balance between providing the shopper with choice, but also showing that you've actually taken on board that personalization element. Because if you take a shopper who's in the market looking for chocolate, or they're searching for chocolate, they're looking for a gift to somebody or whatever, in that sense, what do you choose to present to them? Because if you search for on a Tesco or a Sainsbury's or an Asda, for argument's sake, you're going to get easily 100 results. That's too much. but how many is a personalized recommendation is the right amount. I don't think anyone actually knows what the right amount is, but clearly you want to be able to show probably a bit of a trade-up opportunity. You want to show them some brands they're familiar with, but maybe you might want to show them some other bits, but that's a retailer stance on it. From a brand perspective, clearly you're going to want to show, the wider breadth and get people more immersed in the world that you've got on the wider portfolio. Similar to in Rob's world, you're always going to want to try and go for the cross-sell where you can and where it's appropriate to do so.
I think the concept of personalization, just by the very definition, is very personalized, and everybody's different. So what I want compared to yourself, Beck, and yourself, Ross, is wildly different. And actually, to your point, Ross, is 100 recommendations enough for me, or far too much for me? You don't know until you test and learn. And I think this is the interesting thing around e-commerce in the UK from a retailer perspective, from a platform perspective, from the ability to understand and learn and then be more creative. I think that's the next avenue for personalization is the creative feel of that experience on an e-com platform. Still think it's very simple at the moment, but I would align with your point, Ross. Is it's an accelerator, and from a brand perspective, the more we can get people to look at not only committing to one brand, maybe into a whole skew of that brand or a cross-category piece, is really interesting. I also think you'll probably see more and more of this kind of co-opetition mentality with brands. So the brand partnerships, how does that translate into e-com, and that kind of food inspiration within that moment of conversion? It'd be really interesting if you can start to look at how you joint bid for attention, if you like, at that point of conversion, how you joint bid for inspiration and meal inspiration at that point of conversion. Because we see it very much at the top of the funnel as you translate through from a consumer to a shopper, and you see bits of it in store as well. And I think we're starting to see more of it in e-com, but I do think as brands become more aware of the benefit of co-opetition, you're competing for eyeballs, you're competing for pounds, but 50% of something is better than 50% of nothing. So using that partnership mentality could see another kind of evolution within personalization within e-com as well.
I think it probably also depends on how safe you're choosing to use from an AI perspective. That there are obviously very much more tame or guaranteed options that you're probably more likely to get conversion versus a risky option. And I think probably similar to this, like it's probably worth referencing Walmart's generative AI approach from a search perspective, that they're basically making occasions and seasons much more easy to shop by, if you type in birthday party, that it serves up all the relevant stuff. Whereas if you do that on pretty much any retailer in the UK, you won't see that. You'll just maybe get the odd birthday cake, for argument's sake. That it's around curating that and showing the things there, but there is obviously opportunity there to, I guess, overlay the personalization on top of that based on what data you do have on the shopper at the moment in time, especially when they're logged in, of course.
I think it's interesting on that because my son and I are dairy free, and finding fun Easter eggs or advent calendars for him, I do it every year. I go through the process every year of finding something that's not boring, because all the plant-based stuff is largely quite boring. So, but I don't like. I normally get the advent calendar on Amazon, and I'll search for it every year. And around about like end of November, mid-November, I don't get a recommendation going, here's some, dairy free. And I feel like it's a really missed opportunity, because I really have to go hunting to find the stuff for him. And like you're saying about overlaying that personalization level, if I'm consistently searching for this, why are they not maximizing that and just making my life a little bit easier? And why aren't companies making more fun advent calendars? But that's a separate issue.
I think it's a good point. Look, the maturity. When we talk about personalization, you talk about from a media experience perspective. It's the AI part of that has been around for decades. Whether or not the capability within in-store AI, and then the output of that search behavior is mapped, is at the same level as clearly Google, YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, whoever you want to go and talk to. I'm not sure it's the same. So I think the maturity phase is going to accelerate over the next kind of 3 or 4 years. But I still think there's probably the crossover in category, the crossover in terminology, the reliance on shopping habits and how consumers finish their journey, and how that data creates a visualization. And to your point, is out of a household of 4 people, there might be 2 that are dairy free, there might be 2 that aren't, and that differential between the household makeup, when you're looking at that shop and that conversion piece, can sometimes skew the AI's kind of output, I would suggest. But I think as it matures, it will start to connect more and more of that awareness of data and differentiation within a specific consumer's journey to spit out more bespoke recommendations.
And I'm sure that we'll see in time that the retailers will, I guess, request more information to try and help that and facilitate that, because there's only so much you can do based on the search data. Literally, you can only draw so many conclusions, like say on the allergens and lifestyle side of things, that they don't necessarily apply to all. That you don't want it to be all plant-based that you're seeing, because that might be too far for some people. Or you might be doing a shop for a relative or somebody else, and then that skews your whole portfolio, and your favourites go completely one direction. So I'm sure we'll certainly see the retailers wake up to that and start doing that once they get better on the AI side of things, and once the platform's ready
that's
for
a really interesting one for me, Ross, is when you talk about favourites. That term favourites is a real critical piece, certainly for brands. I don't know, it's slightly out of kilter from your question, Becca, or your example, Becca. But I mean, for me, when we look at that from an e-commerce perspective, how do we get in to become a favourite, as opposed to, if we're not a favourite, how do we disrupt? And how can we use AI to almost supplant our brands within that? And that inspiration, that understanding, the methodology of the AI is a really important piece. Don't think anybody's got it right. We certainly haven't, but it's certainly a topic for discussion internally around, what's a favourite strategy and how do you disrupt if you're not in there? Because age-old tactics like, your bidding tactics and your point of conversion, have been around forever, and it's quite boring. I want something that's really creative and inspirational, and I'm searching for something like an AI tool that will spit something out that is groundbreaking. And I think when you talk about groundbreaking and breaking the mold, that's the favourite environment, because those people are the brand loyalists.
There's a 7-Eleven that now has cameras where they track where people stop, and they count how long they stand there and what they're looking at. And I mean, that kind of collection of data it's not intrusive, and yet the information that it gives to retailers must be incredible. What are they looking at? How long are they spending? What are they picking up? What are they putting down? What do they eventually buy? Amazing.
I mean, I think that's just brilliant. You're probably 10, 15 years ago, there was a study in the States around monitoring device as well, to that same extent, of where were people starting their journey and ending it? How long were they spending in moments on that journey? So was it, 8 hours at a particular destination, having left home within a city? Did they go out to the cinema? It's the same context of mapping. So from a media perspective, you look at that and go, that's brilliant. I know it can be done. From a retailer perspective, all of a sudden you started to go, hold on a second, why don't we kind of compartmentalize this into store? To the context of, okay, well, we know more about footfall. Can we then look at programmatic delivery? Can we look at how that translates into understanding of demographics in front of a fridge, in front of a display? So is it male, female, age, sex, religion, whatever it may be? Part of that is now happening, and so there are kind of a few examples of that in the States that are starting to see, where you go, wow, that's pretty cool. And not only just from a retailer environment perspective, but also a brand story. I think it takes it almost, it changes the dynamic of the funnel from consumer to shopper to actually just a brand story throughout the whole journey. Storytelling in store at that point as well, which I think, when we look at retail media and the evolution of that, digitization of that outside of the e-com side of things, incredible kind of event horizon, I think, for creative in the next few years.
Absolutely, certainly on the retail media piece, seeing that kind of grown exponentially in that sense, certainly in Europe, and trying to catch up from the US that are kind of leading the charge in that sense. That I think the opportunities are plentiful there from a personalization perspective, albeit less so from an in-store perspective, of course. But excited to see where that goes, and the number of retail media networks that are springing up that are opening up more opportunities for multiple categories.
Everywhere, aren't they? Like
Yeah.
every other day, someone's launching a new retail media network. What are some innovative examples of personalized advertising that have notably increased engagement and sales for CPG brands?
So in this sense, I think it's probably tricky in terms of pulling out specific examples for certain brands, but I'd certainly say in terms of who's leading the charge in this sense, certainly similar to the retail media topic we were kind of just on, would be around Amazon AMC and their custom audiences. For some of our clients, seeing some real success stories here, and brands, punching above their weight and overturning, offline market shares in that sense. It's just all around the unparalleled granularity that you can go to and how far back you can retarget. I think that is the real sweet spot in terms of what can be done in that space. Just really understanding a little bit more in greater depth versus perhaps some of the others that are out there at the moment in terms of how you can target people, and that's, for me, is really innovative, and they've kind of set the benchmark for that. And I guess outside of Amazon, I'd probably go that there's some other bits, and I'd probably come at this more from a retailer lens, but obviously there's opportunity for brands to get involved. Probably might have seen earlier on this week around Tesco going down the AI route with their loyalty programs. They tested this probably about 9 months ago or so. I remember receiving it myself, and it was going to spend X amount on cooking sauces in a set period, and you unlock a certain amount of loyalty points, for example. So the fact that they're going big with this later on this month suggests to me that that's kind of worked quite well for them. And outside of that, again, there's Sainsbury's with their personalised prices as well. That feels like quite a nice one in terms of framing that around what the shoppers actually buy and taking it away from the traditional, here's a set promotional plan and people buying it on promotion. And I think there's always certainly some of my friends and family that it blows their minds that there's actually a promotional plan that sits behind the scenes, that it might be on promotion again, and if you wait 6 weeks or a certain period of time. In that sense, I think my examples are all from a retailer perspective, but I think there's certainly more and more of this happening, and people getting on board with the data that's available, and obviously utilising presumably some AI behind the scenes to make that happen, or at least in a more efficient manner.
I think those examples are really interesting as well. Obviously, we've got very close relationships with all retailers as an agnostic brand or set of brands. But I think your conversation there, Ross, is absolutely right. Using that to inspire is great. I think the flip side to it is, my wife says this to me every day, is the loyalty cards are great, but I carry 4 or 5 in my wallet. What's the real price? If you miss that promotional piece, or you don't carry your card around, you don't have it to hand, you feel dumb. You feel like you've paid X amount more for something. But I think that's the flip side. That's the danger for retailers. I think from a brand perspective, relying on that opportunity to plug in that AI, and again, that true understanding of consumer habits and events is really interesting, and the ability to then plug that in as a kind of personalization map, because I think not everybody reacts to true personalization. Whether it's for me, Rob, or us as a household, or us as a certain group audience persona, then sometimes that's enough personalization. For some people, tech enthusiasts are constantly, we have a number in the business, and as I'm sure you do, Ross, with the agency, the tech enthusiasts are constantly saying more personalization. I want more connection, more data given for more value return. You kind of go, I hear you, but for some people that's quite uncomfortable. So I think as brands, it's really important you do your due diligence on your partners with retailers to understand what that data is, how far does it go, and what the opportunity for return is. Also, what's the cost of that? Because when you're working in margins for a product, if the cost of the inventory or the opportunity to connect outweighs the profit you're going to get back, long term, is that of value? So I think there's a fine line between kind of going, this is brilliant, we want to be inspirational, we want to be innovative with our activations, But as a cooperative, as Arla are, we're farmer owned, so everything we do has to effectively provide a positive response for the farmers. If we don't do that because it's costing more money, then we'd probably have to then think about our tactics around that. So again, fine line around that. But I think the examples you've given are great, by the way.
I think just to build on some of that, some of the pieces that we kind of see around almost like smart passes, you imagine on your Apple Wallet or Android equivalent, that you've almost got that personal connection with a brand whereby you can communicate through that you create an agnostic loyalty card system specifically with the brand. It might lend itself better to a D2C environment, but you could still push them for a QR code to work in a physical store, or have a code that worked in outside of that environment. Sure. So I think there's a lot of, particularly in the US, that's kind of the direction that's moving. And I think we'll certainly see more from a loyalty perspective of driving that kind of personalization throughout them.
You know who does personalization pretty well is Pets at Home. Pets at Home know my cat's names. Don't know why they know my cat's names, but I'm sure when you sign up for their loyalty thing, you have to input your cat's names. And I don't get posts; my cats get posts. So
that's amazing.
Every time I always open it because it's to my cat. Whereas if it was just a Pets at Home that was addressed to me, it'd probably just go straight in the recycling. But because it's addressed to my cat, care of me, I'm always like, oh well, it's for my cat, so I open it.
I think from a brand perspective, there's permission to play there with personality, and as I want to say owner or human partner of said pet, you react to that. So I think the permission to play as a brand, I think they've absolutely nailed that. I think that's fantastic
too, because they have like their parenting club, and when you are very early in the trenches and there's all these things that you need to buy, they're constantly like updating you with specials and things specifically for the age group that your child is, which I think is just,
again, just the understanding of the need state and the data availability suddenly becomes extremely valuable and a real opportunity to play authentically in that place. And it's not always that case for every brand or every moment, but I think those types of businesses that you've evidenced there, Becca, is very much around, do I understand my audience? Do I truly understand what drives their mentality? If you get that as a brand, then it's gold dust.
Certainly, I think the phrase would be around pet parents is the one that normally is the one that springs to mind, as well as I guess young parents in that sense. You can't get a better advocacy and loyalty basis than kind of helping somebody navigate that, whether or not it be newborn or new to looking after a cat, dog, or whatever the pet might be in that instance. That I think that's something that sticks with somebody straight off the bat from that. It's a tough job to overturn that. We were talking about favourites earlier, like the power of the brand in that instance. Must be massively hard to overturn that.
I said in the beginning that 50% of consumers don't trust brands to be responsible with their data. So we're trying to move forward with AI and trying to personalize everything because consumers love that. Brands love it. We know it makes, it forms better relationships. But then we still have half of consumers very untrusting of that. How do we navigate this? How do we go forward? How do we make sure that we're balancing those two sides of the coin?
Look, I think it's a really interesting kind of question to answer, and it's not something that you can do in 45 minutes. You could spend 4 days discussing this and still not have a solution. Again, you're going to have people that will commit to very quickly a value exchange and therefore will commit to providing data and trusting that use of data. You'll have people that are really hot on data usage and will monitor how their own personal data is used, and they'll make an informed decision on who they are happy to share that data with. But they will then monitor it, and then you'll have people that will put the walls up and will detach from technology, as we've seen a growing kind of trend around that. So it's an interesting one for brands. You hear the horror stories when data is not used correctly. Never mind leaks or anything like that, but when the personalization message goes to somebody that it shouldn't do, and it becomes a really emotive kind of sore subject and an area of tension. That's the problem. I think that the technology around data management, has improved no end, but you've still got a blended approach between technology and humans that manage part of that. So there's always going to be issues around it. I think it all comes down to what's the value exchange? Is it really going to impact and empower me in my life? If that's the case, then there's value and I'm happy to test it and we'll go from there. Experience is a good thing. If you get a good experience straight away, then brilliant. Your experience with pets at home, you will continue to buy from them. Where you're looked after and not seen as just a number or an open wallet, then you're going to have more relevance with the brand. And I think that's a really important thing. And I think in the past, and I'm talking probably decades ago, when it was all email loyalty and email lists that were being sold left, right, and centre, and it was the issue with ambulance chasers and insurance companies. We've all been there. That put a real shade on it. But actually, a lot of businesses that came out from that have learned from it and actually react to it in terms of, simple things like, it's your birthday, happy birthday. I'm not selling you anything. I'm just wishing you a happy birthday. Have a great Christmas. Blah, blah, blah. And that is the human element of a loyalty relationship. So I think it's a really interesting one and will always continue to develop.
I'd probably say, again, outside of the D2C environment, brands are probably less likely to be the custodians of the data, that it's more likely to be the retailers. And I'd say that there's going to be more trust for the retailers within reason, again, providing that they behave appropriately across the board in that sense. So I think arguably there'd be trust there from a retailer standpoint, again, unless it's breached or anything untoward was to happen to it in that sense. And I think outside of that, there's other bits that obviously have happened in recent years in terms of like opting out of certain communications, whether or not that be like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, those kind of things that could be quite emotional topics in that sense, that there's certainly drive towards that. But that isn't done across the board in that sense. Certainly there's a handful of retailers that spring to mind, but I don't think everyone necessarily does that, from a seasonal perspective.
I just add on to that, Ross. I think you're right. It's the power and the opportunity for retailers when we think about retail media and the retail data is evident. The way it is used, I think, is historically with the club cards and Nectar has been excellent, but obviously that needs to evolve. And when you start to trade on that more and more, then the expectations around it become heightened as well. And maybe there's a piece around that in terms of just clarity as a tactic around data management and usage from a retailer for brands as part of the onboarding processes. We don't hold first party data, so we'll use Nectar, we'll use Tesco, Club Card, etc. The onboarding process, the real clarity on how that data is protected and managed from their side, so it doesn't become a brand gets tarnished through an issue with the data that is out of their control, is a really important point. The other thing I think other brands might have to consider is legislation, how legislation changes. So if you think about HFSS and how that influences the food industry, potentially the dairy industry, whatever it may be, where we haven't naturally had first party data, we may well have to start to think about that, because if another government comes in and heightens the restrictions around HFSS advertising, then you need to have that organic community to be able to have that dialogue and communication. So it's not on the radar, in the front of the radar, but it's certainly on the edge of the radar for us in terms of, okay, we need to understand how our retailers use and manage data. Do we need to consider that as a long-term strategy as well, based on conditions that are outside of our responsibility, i.e. what changes with HFSS regulations in the future? And I would imagine there's probably a number of businesses that are looking at the same concern issue, however you want to dress it up.
What are the next big trends in AI and data analytics that redefine personalization and e-com for consumer goods?
Everybody talks about connected home. I think that's obvious. You see that with the apps available to turn your heating on, to set up any recordings through devices, etc. The connotation around the connected home is obvious. The connection with retailers and the ability to understand the connected home from either arguably the big shop or the convenience shop is really important as well. And if you then throw in wearables to that, so the connected environment at home, the connected individual, and how you then sync that to a retailer experience. So, am I leaving home? Am I traveling to work? How am I being communicated with if I need food inspiration for that evening or for breakfast or for whatever it may be? Whatever it may be, I might be going to the gym at lunchtime. I think this concept of connectivity, taking the data from home to store to wearables, is a really interesting dynamic that could offer a whole new world for brands, for people, for retailers, and media on how you connect that kind of experience, inspiration, and conversion. So I think there's a real kind of area of exploration around that. The concept of location and availability.
Yeah, I like your thoughts on the tech side of things. My kind of take on it was probably more around just how quickly and dynamic, I guess the shopping journey can be in that sense. Whether or not it's literally, much more personalization of what landing page that you arrive on, as opposed to having a handful of products that are picked for you. That the whole page is more bespoke to what it is that you buy. And all the other factors in the data, from a demographic perspective, that you would have a look at, you would be kind of considered for in that sense. And even the navigation might be based on that. We've spoken a lot around pets earlier in that sense. If you don't have a pet, let's just take it out of the hierarchy for argument's sake, quite a radical step in that sense. But just to simplify it, because there's an awful lot from a taxonomy perspective. And I think, I've kind of touched on it before around the pricing side of things in that sense. It wouldn't surprise me if we see more dynamic pricing. Amazon's normally the one that's heralded for having prices that changes very dynamically in that sense, but I think we'll probably see more of that kind of coming through, and short of not logging in, people will be unaware about that. And probably, again, we've touched on it with kind of partnerships in the past. It was probably around almost like bundling to that sense, whereby you might cluster products together that may not necessarily always be kind of seen together, but on that kind of algorithm basis and machine learning of what do people frequently buy, that I think there's opportunity to increase basket sizes by utilising the technology behind the scenes there. Just a couple of thoughts.
I think there's an opportunity to combine both of those. I really good points, Ross. The concept for us as well is around the food inspiration piece and the impact on food usage and reducing food waste. So the convenience of food mapping, food planning for busy households, consumers with less time. If you get that from your experience from an e-com perspective, the delivery service as well, and what does that look like? But then if you add the other layer of connectivity from a home, from a wearable through to store, again, the whole environment of convenience based on technology and understanding a consumer household and how tastes may change, but providing inspiration through their experience through e-com or whatever it may be, I think is a really interesting area, because that spider web of making a shopping experience fun but easy, and how you connect that through multiple layers is the next evolution. I think everyone's trying to map that out and make it simple for everybody else, simple for consumers, inspire consumers to spend more, spend it on brands rather than own label, for example. Why is that important? So I think, to your point, that extended layer of understanding within the e-com environment, but add a further layer outside of that in with technology.
It's almost like we need to strive towards establishing a consumer life cycle as opposed to a consumer journey. It needs to be more of a all-inclusive, everywhere they are, meet them where they are, and be there to establish that kind of loyalty and that relationship.
I think you're getting
make it more
towards
human.
that phase with retail media networks already. The nirvana for that would be that very kind of image, that ideation of, right people, right moment, wherever, right message. turning a consumer into a shopper. So I think that journey is happening. It's still very embryonic, but I think this hugely fragmented universe we all live in, with a multitude of touch points, arguably could become even more interconnected through the use of retail data and that connectivity of touch points in the coming years. I see that as a kind of evolutionary change.
Thanks very much for your time, guys. I really appreciate it. Some great points, some great examples. And I think it's really interesting, especially because we're obviously speaking more from retail side and Rob more from brand side. And it's just interesting to hear how they kind of converge and work together and see how it's going to land over the next couple of years. But thank you so much for your time.